Uh, for the record, this is February 1st, 2021, and this is the Senate Judiciary and Public Safety Committee. We have two items on our agenda today. The first being a presentation by Senator Clausen, Senate File 104, involving identity theft crime, technical change in language and authorization. So welcome, Senator Clausen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair Limmer and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to present Senate File 104. It's a bill to clarify Minnesota Statute 201, Section 609.527, Subdivision 3.
Senator Clausen, before we go any further, I just want the record to show we have quorum. Please proceed.
Thank you. Well, Subdivision 3 contains two unrelated clauses. Clause 5 begins addressing identity theft, but also references offenses relating to the possession or distribution of pornographic material. So we have one notation containing two unrelated provisions. And this results in a misrepresentation of information when a background check is conducted, listing the person's offense as identity theft or child pornography. And a prospective employer, unfortunately, is not going to distinguish between the word or, but rather interprets the notation as and when reviewing the background check document. And you have been provided an actual background check document for Angeline Jarazek showing both identity theft and child pornography on the document. And what Senate File 104 does, it separates these two different offenses into two different numbered clauses. And at this time, Mr. Chair, I would like Angela Jarazek to share her story on how this simple drafting of words has affected her life.
Thank you, Senator Clausen. Ms. Jarazek, are you with us? I see you. Could you, Angela. Yeah, please identify yourself and then you can proceed with
this has affected me in more ways than you can believe or even understand, probably. I take full responsibility for what I did do. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I made a mistake, because I didn't. Because when I was that age, almost 10 years ago, I intentionally went out and I did intentionally steal people's identities and money, and it wasn't right. But what I didn't do was the child pornography. What I didn't do shouldn't be there. For me, every time I go to try to get a job, I'm told no because of that. It's not just because of the identity theft and the check forgery. It's also because this child pornography that I didn't do. People are looking at me like I'm a pervert. I'm not a pervert. It's not something I would ever do in my life, but because of a statute and the way it was written and it being added together, I guess, it's been hard for me to find work. Right now, I'm still unemployed. Because of COVID, I lost my job at the hotel and can't find another job. I've tried. Trust me, I've tried. It's difficult. It took me a long time to even get this place to live. I was homeless for a long time because nobody wanted to rent to me. And I got lucky enough to, find a landlord who was willing to give me a chance and believe the fact that I really didn't commit that crime. And like I said, I take responsibility for what I did. I'm not going to say I'm perfect, because I'm not. I'm human. But I know I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago. I just believe that, it's unfair to label this on somebody who didn't do it. I don't see how a financial crime and a sex crime is even grouped in the same statute to begin with, to be honest. It's kind of frustrating. Very frustrating. I guess that's all I really have, to be honest. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ms. Jarazek. Are there questions for Senator Clausen or for our testifier? I do not see anyone raising hands. Well, Senator Kiffmeyer first, then Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I couldn't quite get quick enough to the raise hand function. One of my questions for Senator Clausen We are fixed, if this bill were to go ahead, it would not help your testifier because she is already in that situation, which is customary. We pass a bill for those things going forward. What happens to people in this kind of a situation when that is the case? And then what is the recourse for your current testifier?
Senator Clausen.
Senator Kiffmeyer and Mr. Chair, that's a very good question. I think in talking with Angeline, she understands that this is not only for her, but for others like her that we may not even know about. I think what she's trying to do is going forward as she applies for additional positions that when they do a background check, it's going to come out with the truth rather than accusing her of something that she didn't do.
Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I understand now. So there will be a benefit to her because of the fact that when that law is passed, then the record will show that as divided for her in that regard. And so she'll have some benefit as well. So I'm sensitive to her story. So that's why I wanted to ask the question. So thank you, Senator Clausen. That helps.
Thank you. If we could get this passed as soon as possible, that would be great.
Senator Pappas.
I just wanted to say, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Ms. Jurisic, for coming forward to work with Senator Clausen and the committee to get this correction made. It really does seem unfair. And, you know, I applaud you for turning your life around. I think when people do the crime and they do the time, they should then have a second chance. And too many of our laws penalize people doubly after they've left incarceration with discrimination in terms of housing and employment. So this is just one of probably many ways that we continue to do that. And I hope that the committee will consider more corrections as they arise. Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other hands up? Seeing none. Would Senator Pappas make the motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move the bill. Unfortunately, I don't have the bill number in front of me.
That's Senate File 104.
I'd like to move Senate File 104 be recommended to pass. And I'm assuming then it goes to the floor. You're not doing an omnibus bill?
Goes to the floor.
Okay, that's my motion.
All right. Senator Pappas moves that Senate File 104 be recommended to pass and move to the floor. Hearing no further discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The motion is adopted. Senator Clausen, thank you for coming to our committee and bringing this issue before us. And Ms. Jurisic, thank you for your testimony. We'll now move on to a presentation by the Office of the Legislative Auditor. It's an evaluation report regarding safety in our state correction system. We have Mr. David Kirchner. He's an evaluation coordinator with the Office of the Legislative Auditor. And then later, Mr. Kirchner will be on for 20 minutes. And then Commissioner Paul Schnell will be given 10 minutes for comments and response. And then we'll open it up for questions after that. Mr. Kirchner, are you with us? Oh, I see you. Thank you. Would you identify yourself for the record and then just proceed with your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is David Kirchner. For the record, I am with the Legislative Auditor's Office, and I was the manager for this evaluation. And since this is the first time that we've presented this report to the Senate, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues that also worked on the evaluation, Caitlin Zanoni-Wells and Tavis Layton, and Caitlin's also on the call today, if I need any help. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to do a slideshow here. So let's go ahead and do that. Mr. Chair, are you seeing the slide on your screen?
Yes, I am.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And so, as the chair said, this is a report that was released last year, just before the beginning of the COVID pandemic outbreak. And I'm going to present the findings that we made in that report. There are about 5 kind of large-scale concerns that I want to kind of organize my presentation around a lack of information that we found, concerns about staffing, concerns about workplace culture within the prisons, within DOC's prisons, some concerns that we had about oversight, and lastly, we want to talk a little bit about the infrastructure at the state's oldest prisons. Just briefly for review, I know that all of you know this, Minnesota has 11 prison facilities, and these range from minimum security boot camps at Togo and Willow River all the way up to the maximum security facility at Oak Park Heights. There are, of course, 2 facilities that are for special populations, the women's prison at Shakopee and the juvenile prison at Red Wing. I will note that we spent most of our time focused on the higher security level facilities, those at level 4 and level 5. So Rush City, St. Cloud, Stillwater, and Oak Park Heights, although we did visit most of the other prisons as well. In January 2020, and of course this has changed, there were about 9,200 prisoners in the system, and most of those had been convicted of violent crimes. About 3 out of 4 had been convicted of violent crimes of the prisoners serving in facilities. Working in those prisons to monitor and to care for those prisoners were about 3,700 staff. The majority of those, about 2,100, were security staff, so corrections officers and lieutenants and so forth. But then there are a variety of other staff, those that provide behavioral health services, regular healthcare services, education, food service, maintenance, and so forth. Let me turn to my first area of concern, and that simply is that measuring safety, which was what we were asked to do, is difficult. The Department of Corrections does not formally measure safety in its prisons. It doesn't give them a grade or a score for how safe the prisons are. And generally speaking, its data on violent incidents that occur within the prisons are not very good. Just to give one example, although we can get a count of the number of incidents that occur between prisoners, we are not able to get a sense of how severe those incidents are. So that is, we know that, say, an assault occurred, but we don't know if anybody was badly injured or went to the hospital, or if it was just simply something that involved cuts and bruises. The biennial reports that the Department of Corrections has released have omitted fights between prisoners. That is, they list assaults between prisoners and the number of assaults that have been reported, but they don't list fights. And we viewed both of those as being violent interactions between prisoners that could result in injury, and we felt both of those should be reported. And we also will note that measuring safety is difficult because some violence that occurs within prisons is not observed and therefore not reported. And this is something that we heard from both prisoners and from staff. Putting together a bunch of different pieces of information, because we couldn't get a kind of clear count, but looking at a lot of different pieces of information and kind of putting them together, they all sometimes told the same story. And so there are some broad things that we can say. We can say, broadly speaking, that in the 4 years prior to our report, violence between prisoners declined slightly each year. And this particular chart shows disciplinary convictions, but that was also true. We looked at a number of other different sources of information as well.
Mr. Kirshner?
Yes.
What's the difference between assault and fighting?
It is, to some extent, a matter of definition, really, by the person making the report, by the corrections officer making the report. Generally speaking, a fight is supposed to be 2 prisoners that kind of get into a conflict with each other, whereas an assault is 1 prisoner attacks another. Determining after the fact which one of those occurred is to some extent a matter of it's not always clear, and you're not always going to get necessarily the same story from the 2 or 3 or 4 prisoners that might be involved in a conflict between one another. Right. So it's we felt it was important to note that there are both types of things occur, but only one has been reported in the department's biennial reports.
Okay, thank you. Please proceed.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
To that point, so is it fair to say that if there's a fight that results in an assault, that's the only time it's going to get reported?
Mr. Kirshner.
Thank you very much for the question, Senator Ingebrigtsen and Mr. Chair. To be clear, they are going to be reported within the Department of Corrections internal processes. So the Department of Corrections has that information. What we are pointing out is that in terms of the public reports that the Department of Corrections has provided to the public and to the legislature, what they have focused on are the assaults. Yes, you are correct that in terms of what would appear in terms of the public information, it would a fight that was somehow also coded as an assault would appear there, but something that was simply coded as a fight would not. But we certainly were able to see both types of information from our review of the full amount of information that the Department of Corrections keeps. Does that answer the question, Senator Ingebrigtsen?
I think so.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think so. If I have any other questions, I'll certainly go ahead and ask.
All right. Mr. Kirshner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Now, as I said, there was a broad decline in violence between prisoners, but in terms of violence against staff, what we saw was a spike that occurred in calendar year 2018. This particular, as you can see, this is a different type of information than the last slide. This is workers' compensation claims, but again, we're drawing from several different sources of information. But there was a spike in 2018 of violence against staff, and that year we saw more incidents against staff than in the prior year or in the year that came afterwards. And of course, there were the deaths of the two corrections officers, Officer Gom and Officer Parisi. So that was a very difficult year for the Department of Corrections. And unfortunately, we do not have a particularly good explanation for why this spike occurred. Most of the explanations about why violence occurs in prisons generally tend to be true for both violence between prisoners and violence against staff. And so having a gradual decline in the one type of information and a spike in the other type of information is kind of hard to explain. We don't have a good explanation for that, but we do note that it occurred. One thing that is not in the information that we felt was important to note is that there are offenses that occur against staff that are sexual offenses. That is, prisoners target usually female staff for harassment, for exposure. They masturbate in front of them. They call them names. They tell them very specific things that they want to do with them. And we heard about this as being an ongoing issue, and it's something that female staff told us they often do not get support from their supervisors or for support from their coworkers in this. Sometimes it's just simply not treated even as an offense at all that the prisoners are accountable for. In addition, the Department of Corrections does not track the frequency of this misconduct, so we cannot really give you information about it, partly because sometimes it's not reported, and partly because when it is reported, it is grouped together with other types of offenses. And so we don't have a good way of measuring this specific type of offense. But we do have a recommendation for the Department of Corrections that it should do more to support its staff, particularly its female staff, when these types of things occur, and take appropriate actions against the prisoners that commit these infractions. I want to move on and talk about staffing shortages. This was a major concern for the Department of Corrections at the time we were doing our work. There were acute shortages at specific prisons, notably at Stillwater and Faribault and Oak Park Heights. At the end of fiscal year 2019, Stillwater was 40 staff below its budgeted allocation of 314 positions. So over 10% down in terms of the number of corrections officers that it was supposed to have by budget allocation. However, we had a difficulty being able to look at these staffing shortages and to indicate how to try and tie those together with violent incidents that occurred, because the department does not track exactly how many staff are working in a prison during any given shift. We can tell you how many staff are employed, but we can't tell you whether or not there were 38 officers on duty during that shift, or 40 officers, or 42 officers. And I'm talking here maybe about an overnight number. Of course, during the daytime, those numbers would be higher. So we were not able to find a connection between those two in terms of the data. However, both prisoners and staff told us that staffing shortages did affect the safety of prisoners and of staff. And there are a variety of reasons for this. Certainly when you have fewer staff, corrections officers have less ability to monitor prisoners. You have staff that are working alone or in small numbers with large numbers of prisoners, making them somewhat more vulnerable. You have increased tensions that occur because when you have fewer staff, prisoners end up being more frequently confined to their cells and are less able to get out and burn off some energy, and you get increased tensions. Staff told us that sometimes they have, when they don't have enough staff, they have difficulty having those developing relationships with prisoners, having informal conversations and so forth that may pay off later when tensions arise because those relationships have been developed. And certainly staff told us that when you are constantly running at a minimum, when you have the very minimum number of staff available, there's no slack for unplanned events. And in fact, unplanned events occur fairly frequently. Each facility has an emergency response team, and we found that those emergency response teams, which I should note, respond not only to violence, but also to things like medical emergencies and so forth. But those are activated 1 to 3 times a day, depending on the prison. And so when those staff are activated to go into emergency response, sometimes they have to be pulled away from other duties, and there isn't really the slack to make up for those officers that are pulled away. Staffing shortages also affect prisoner activities, and this is important because there is good research to suggest that structured prisoner activities, whether you're talking about education or behavioral health therapy or simply recreating out in the yard, that those activities lead to less violence that occurs in prisons, and they also lead to less recidivism, that prisoners are less likely to commit additional offenses after they are released from prison. Both staff and prisoners that we spoke with said that providing activities more consistently would improve safety. Again, we were not able to track using data how often there is a relationship between the cancellation of activities and the occurrence of violent incidents, because the Department of Corrections does not track that information. And so we weren't able to draw that particular correlation. Staffing shortages also have led to very heavy overtime use. We found that officer overtime had nearly quadrupled between 2013 and 2019 at the state's prisons. And in fact, prisons often forced corrections officers to work overtime, that is, required them to stay at the end of an 8-hour shift to work another 8-hour shift because there was simply not someone to come and take their place. The staff that we spoke with overwhelmingly agreed that this high amount of overtime, and particularly high amounts of forced overtime, affected job performance. Officers are less alert, less able to do what they need to do, sometimes even maybe a little bit more irritable. So we have some general staffing recommendations for the department. Certainly the Department of Corrections, we should continue its efforts to improve hiring and retention. We suggested that the department increase its minimum staffing level for shifts, so you have a little bit more of a cushion for these unplanned events that actually occur frequently enough that we think that they can be planned for. And we think that the department needs to begin tracking the extent of staffing shortages, of overtime use, and of cancellation of prisoner activities, so that we can get a better understanding of the relationship between these occurrences and violence that occurs in the prisons. I'm going to move on now to the next segment of my presentation, looking at some concerns that we had about workplace culture.
Mr. Kirshner,
Yes,
excuse me.
Mr. Chair.
Senator Ingebrigtsen, could you hold your question until after Mr. Kirshner's done with his presentation?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One significant concern that we found is that in terms of workplace culture is that we found that when we surveyed staff that worked in the state's correctional facilities, 1 in 3 told us that bullying and harassment among staff was a problem at their facility. And this number was even higher for female staff and African-American staff. And I want to note that this was across all prisons and across all job categories. So it was not just corrections officers, but also maintenance staff and behavioral health staff and so forth. And it wasn't just at the higher security facilities, it was at other facilities as well. There were differences between the facilities, but even at the facility where the fewest number of people said this was a problem, it was still 1 in 5. So it was still an area that we thought was deeply concerning. And when we spoke individually with staff members, or some of them contacted us independently, we heard some really troubling stories of retaliation against staff members for speaking out or for following rules sometimes. And sometimes those stories of retaliation involved supervisors. A separate concern that we had about kind of culture within the Department of Corrections is that we found that an awful lot of decisions related to safety relied on mostly kind of subjective, informal impressions, that high-profile incidents, one major thing would occur, those often led to specific policy changes, whereas certain types of things that were kind of low-level things that never kind of rose to this kind of high-profile major incident could kind of percolate along for a long time without a whole lot of action being taken to address it. We generally found that there was not a whole lot of systematic evaluation of past decisions. So we would ask, for example, administrators, have you made changes that have improved security at your facility? And they always say, yes, we can think of several things that we can talk about. And they would tell us of changes that they had made. But when we would ask, how did you measure whether or not those changes actually made a difference? We often found that they return to these kind of more subjective, informal impressions. Well, I hear a lot of things, I talk to people, and not a reliance upon using data. And certainly in those administrators' defense, part of this is related to overall issues related to the Department of Corrections' lack of good data around violent incidents, which makes it harder to use that information to make decisions. So we have a couple of broad recommendations for the department here related to workplace culture. Certainly, the department needs to begin taking strong action to address bullying and harassment among staff. That's a very disturbing finding that we had. And we encourage the department to move toward more systematic, more data-driven decision-making in its decisions around safety. I want to move now to talk a little bit about oversight. And the Department of Corrections is different from other jails in the state because county jails are required to be licensed. So they are inspected on a regular basis by the department's licensing division, and they are inspected on a number of things, including how they protect the safety of the prisoners and of the staff. The Department of Corrections facilities are not subject to that same kind of outside oversight. There are what are called security audits, which the department has done voluntarily. They're not required to do this by law. Which are peer reviews of security procedures. That is, a number of other staff from other prisons will all come together and visit, say, Stillwater or St. Cloud to review their security procedures. And we thought that these were generally pretty good reviews. We thought they were useful to the staff, but we found that they were done fairly infrequently. The last security audit at St. Cloud was in 2011. The last one at Rush City, I believe, was in 2013. So they're not happening very often. And also the recommendations from those security audits are not binding. There's no requirement that the administration of prisons follow the recommendations that are made. Or even report to the central office about what they've done in response to them. So generally speaking, we think that there needs to be some sort of regular assessment by somebody outside of each prison about how well they're doing on their safety protocols. And we can think of a couple different ways this could be done. The legislature could bring the department under the licensure procedures that now apply to county jails. You might have to change some of those licensing standards a little bit because prisons and jails are different. Or you could mandate that security audit process in law and require that it occurs on a more frequent basis and require that there be some sort of ongoing follow-up to the recommendations that are made as a result of those security audits. Lastly, I want to talk about infrastructure. This is, to some extent, a difficult conversation, but because it involves a lot of money. But basically, St. Cloud and Stillwater prisons are over 100 years old, and the living units there create safety challenges, both for the prisoners and for the staff. I have a picture here on the slide. This is taken from the point of view of an officer's station in one of the Stillwater living units. And as you can see, it's very difficult for officers to directly observe cells that are off to the side or up high in the air over their heads. They have to rely on cameras and other types of cues as to to what's going on. And generally nobody builds prisons this way anymore, and there's a reason they don't build prisons this way anymore. It's because there are problems with setting up prisons this way. And if you have a fight that occurs in a cell, and maybe it's up on the third or on the fourth tier, then you have prisoners that might spill out of a cell, struggling with one another, and they're 30, 35 feet above a concrete floor with only a railing in between them. And you have staff members that are running up there to try and break up that fight and keep everyone as safe as possible. And they are also subjected to the possibility of dropping over that railing. We find that to be a really difficult state of affairs. And generally speaking, we think it's time to start a conversation about these very, very old facilities. And so we recommend that the department present a long-term plan to the legislature for the rehabilitation or replacement of the very, very old units at St. Cloud and Stillwater. We recognize that there's a lot of money involved there, and that's going to be a difficult conversation for everyone, but we don't believe that the state should continue, in the long term, to be using 100-year-old living units until they become 150 and 200-year-old living units. We believe it's time to start this conversation. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I have one other slide. I forgot. I wanted to swing back around to information because it's something I've brought up a number of times in the course of this presentation. We think the department needs to transform its data collection processes. And I use the word transform because we don't want to make the recommendation the department simply gather more data, because the department was already short-staffed at the time that we did our work. Instead, the department needs to change the way it gathers data so that it ends up gathering more data using less effort, using forms of technology, using different work processes so that data is gathered along the way as people do their work and is not something that requires extra work in order to gather. But the department does need more data in order to make better decisions, and so it better understands how often violent events occur, how often you have staffing shortages, how often overtime is used, how often prisoners are prevented from participating in activity, how often prisoner discipline occurs. So we encourage the department to look for ways to transform the way it gathers data so that it has better information on all of these matters. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm done with my presentation. I would be happy to take any questions, although I don't know if you're going to have me take questions now or wait until after the department goes.
Mr. Kirshner, if you could wait in the wings for
I will do
the
that,
Q&A,
sir.
and we're going to move directly into listening to the next 10 minutes for Commissioner Schnell, and then we'll open it up for questions. I see we have 3 hands already, so hold your place, everyone, and we'll hear from the Commissioner. Commissioner, welcome to our committee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and committee members. Paul Schnell from the Department of Corrections, and again, pleased to be here today. I want to start out by just saying, first of all, that I'm really appreciative of the work of the OLA from the beginning. And when the findings came in, first of all, we expected, and I know certainly the expectations of all of you that agencies will fully support the work of the OLA as they do these audits, and we did that. But I also want to be clear that when the report came forward and we reviewed it, we reviewed that report and we accepted the findings and recommendations in whole. And I think it's important to recognize that, because I think, as coming in as a new administration, we learned a lot from them. Some of the things we were aware of, and in many cases, we had work underway. But there were many things that the OLA report helped inform us on, and I think has allowed us and to help us focus our attention on the areas that are really most important. I want to talk just about very quickly about a couple of things that we did really from the time the report was the investigation was occurring by OLA, and then since then. Out of the concerns raised by Mr. Kirshner, the Office of Professional Accountability was established. And this is an internal investigative body that was created. In the past, we had seen that oftentimes management staff or supervisory staff in the facilities would be conducting investigations of these really serious incidents, harassment, bullying, the kinds of things that the OLA found in their investigation. And along the way, we felt that it was really important that there was higher levels of integrity in those investigations, that we wanted supervisors to be focused on supervising and let people who really had that specialty in investigations do these investigations. And since the establishment of the Office of Professional Accountability, OPA, in February of 2020, they have conducted 150 investigations with approximately 100 substantiated findings. And these, in addition to just the investigations, they focused at a deeper level at looking at issues of custom and practice and policy that we can ultimately address to hopefully rectify some of those situations and prevent them in the future. I know that we sent a letter out to you and laid out some of these things, and I just want to cover a couple of them. We've focused heavily over the last year on our strategic plan. And while our strategic plan is both aspirational, I want to just point out that we believe it's critically practical. It focuses on and lifts up safety, the kinds of services we provide to the people within our facilities, and the promotion of being more data-driven in the decisions that we make. We've coined this notion of the phrase being data-rich and information poor. And oftentimes in the OLA's report and in talking with them afterward, they found disparate pieces of information that they could piece together. But ultimately, that information wasn't as particularly useful until it's put together, analyzed, and really built into information that can inform decision making. And as we did our reorganization, which I've mentioned before, one of the things that we focused on extensively in that was making sure that organizational performance measurement is key. Now that's a bit challenged, and I'll talk about this in a short time, but it's a challenge by some of the data systems. We have, in addition to aging infrastructure within our facilities and themselves, investments in technology, as you know, across our state are difficult and so critically important as we go forward. We've also really focused heavily on cultural change. As was pointed out, we noted the experience of our employees of color and many times women in our facility. We have created some BIPOC groups for the Black, Indigenous, and persons of color after the killing of George Floyd. And those groups continue to meet to talk about the experience of working for the department and wanting to address those issues. As we looked at the issue of sexual harassment by our female staff, we really invested more heavily in trying to make sure that we had adequate support services for our staff. And we created a peer support mechanism that's staffed with people who are actually doing outreach. And we also provide critical incident stress debriefing and management following incidents of more significant profile. Our staffing levels, as was pointed out, is a concern, and one of the challenges. While we have been able to increase our numbers overall, and we're grateful to the legislature for providing funding so that we could go forward, one of the things I will say is that that as those numbers have increased and as we've been able to increase our hiring, as I mentioned to you before in the presentation on COVID response, we have been challenged because of the demand on our workforce and the number of people who've been out on various levels of COVID leave or who themselves were out because they contracted COVID. I just want to highlight a couple more things and then I'll end and stand for questions, Mr. Chair, and that is the agency is really focused on trying to increase communication, engagement with our staff, engagement with the people in our population. I'm really proud of the fact that our staff and really the men and women in our population, we did not have unrest during the course of this pandemic, which really challenged the environment that people are living in and working in. And I think it's a testament to our staff and to the people we serve that they didn't respond in that way. We have discontinued double bunking in some of the facilities to, again, both address issues around creating adequate space and social distancing, but also to improve the safety of our facilities. And we believe that this has truly helped. And at the end of the day, we look forward to the opportunity to have discussions with our elected leaders across the state to talk about the direction going forward. We know that investment in a new prison is somewhere between $350 and $500 million. We also know that the Department of Corrections has more than $600 million in deferred maintenance. We anticipate somewhere in the vicinity of about $20 million in needs for technology investments to truly be have that state-of-the-art kind of orientation. As an agency, we're committed to getting there, despite the challenges that we recognize our state faces in light of COVID. But ultimately, we are developing systems to be able to better track and manage and monitor and analyze the situations that have been highlighted by the OLA report. With that, Mr. Chair, I would just say thank you for the opportunity to highlight a few of these things, and I would stand for any questions that the committee has. Mr. Chair, if that was for me, I was unable to hear. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, you're on mute.
Mr. Chair, you're on mute.
Yes, we're trying to figure that out. Just a second.
I am back. We'll blame it on Commissioner Snell. We'll open it up for questions right now. And Senator Ingebrigtsen, you are first in line.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kirshner, if I could, staffing shortages, being an old keeper of a jail in the county level, I know, and I think you commented on this, that counties can be sanctioned or they can be, put on notice that things have to change from the Department of Corrections if they don't run their jails right. And we don't have that oversight for state prisons or state corrections. Did you have any ideas as to how to go about doing that? I know there's a national, and I think Commissioner Snell knows this, there's a national standard when it comes to jails and prisons, but there really isn't anybody there to slap the fingers of somebody that's not doing it right. And I also have some concerns about, and I'll ask, if I could, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Snell, a couple of questions.
So do you want to hear from Mr. Kirshner first?
Please, if I could, yeah, as to what his suggestions would be, Mr. Chair, as far as some kind of a group coming in and doing, you talked about, mandating more security audits, and I think that's a good idea. Maybe the legislature should look at that. I don't know what kind of a cost would come with that, but not just, in-state, audits, peer reviews, have people come from other states possibly, and maybe that's what already happens. Could you comment a little further on that?
Mr. Kirshner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Senator Ingebrigtsen. I believe what you're referring to is the accreditation through the American Correctional Association. And that is something that the department did put into place a few years ago. And frankly, we were not impressed. We looked at the reviews of the facilities that the American Correctional Association did, and we didn't think that they were honestly very helpful. The department chose in 2019 to discontinue that accreditation process, and we frankly didn't have a big concern about that with regard to safety. Now, I want to clarify that we had made a previous suggestion about using about the American Correctional Association accreditation process with regard to healthcare in prison systems from an earlier report of ours several years ago. And I will note that we did not look at whether or not the accreditation was a good thing for health services within prisons, because that wasn't the subject of this report. But with regard to safety, we weren't terribly impressed. And so rather than suggesting that as a process for external oversight, we instead went in the two directions I talked about, either bringing the department under the licensing process, and that could be a process by which the department, licenses itself. There's a wall put up between the licensing entity and between the rest of the department. The Department of Human Services does that same sort of a thing for the facilities that it runs. It has a licensing division that is separate from the rest of the department. So that is one approach. Another approach, as I suggested, would be because we did think that these security audits, these peer reviews were good. We thought, but they just were infrequent and there wasn't a whole lot of follow-up. We thought that putting those into law and giving them the force of law, requiring that they be done on a routine basis, and requiring some form of follow-up could be another path to just having a regular outside look at the facilities and how they're protecting the safety of the staff and of the prisoners that live there.
Mr. Chair, just a quick follow-up on that, if I could then. The staffing ratios then are just... The staff, excuse me, Mr. Chair, the staffing ratios then, Mr. Kirshner, are just made up by whatever administration then, as far as the commissioner would make up the staffing ratios for the prisons?
Mr. Chair?
Yes. Mr.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if you'd recognize me. Yes, Senator Ingebrigtsen, I think the commissioner can maybe speak to that a little bit better than I can, but generally speaking, the department has a certain budget that it has available to it to hire people to work in the prison facilities, and they have a variety of different things that they need to be able to provide in those facilities, not just security, but also healthcare and food and other things. And so the department works out how many staff that it is able to have in the facilities. However, I want to note that there is the number of staff that are on the books, and there is something different, which is the number of staff that are actually there during second shift on February 2nd. And those two things may or may not be the same. And one of the challenges that we had is that we wanted to be able to look and see, if we're down second shift on February 2nd, was there an incident that day because there were a bunch of people out sick or because off at training or something. And we weren't able to draw that correlation between who actually was on duty, how many people were on duty, and whether or not incidents occurred, because the department did not have that granular level of data as to who was working at any given point in time. So we could see the total number of people that were employed at a facility, but not on a day-to-day, shift-to-shift basis who actually was in the facility providing security and the other services.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You got a lot of people with questions, so I'll just hold myself if I can, for the latter part of the meeting.
All right. We're going to move to Commissioner Schnell. Commissioner, if you wanted to make comment regarding Senator Ingebrigtsen's inquiry.
Well, I would, Mr. Chair, Senator Ingebrigtsen, I would just say that, I agree. One of the things that we have been talking about, and one of the things is the committee members know that there is a number of issues that have surfaced around our jail and inspections process that have resulted in some media attention and some really difficult situations being exposed. And we know that we need to invest there. We need to work on that. One of the things that we've been doing over the last several months is working with the Sheriff's Association to talk about that. And one of the things that we heard loud and clear, and one of the things that we committed to, was ensuring that the standards that we enforce in county jails are also something that we apply to ourselves. And so as we began to work through, and ultimately we'll be coming forward with a proposal to address the needs across our state and address the concerns that have been raised, both on the jails and frankly by the OLA report, that we need to invest in some additional personnel to conduct these inspections and create the kind of documentation. And we want that applied both internally. Our reorganization actually set that firewall up that Mr. Kirshner was talking about, moving them into an area of the department, which is a bit separated from the facilities operations division, so that these things can happen. And we think that the combination of doing security audits, this is the very same things we're talking about with our sheriffs across the state, that we can, between general security audits that occur and regular audits and inspection activities by our inspections unit, both of our facilities as well as county facilities, will create a safer system for our staff and the people that are in our facilities across the state.
Thank you, Commissioner. Senator Kiffmeyer is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very interesting. And since I serve on the Legislative Audit Commission, we see over the past years, I've seen many audits and reviewed them, and they've always been very, very helpful. Their goal in the Legislative Auditor's Office is to put things in such a way that it helps to correct, not just point out problems. And I always appreciate those key recommendations. One of the things that really bothers me, though, Mr. Kirchner, is that when you don't have data, whether it's data on violent crimes, inconsistent, incomplete, underreported, just a number of these areas. And then when I got to the point, Mr. Kirchner, where there wasn't a count of actual staff in these areas on site by shifts. I mean, as a nurse, the hospital is huge. But if there's one thing they do is they know they have to meet requirements of staff. And the other thing is HR. You've got to keep track of many of these things because in human resources, the paycheck is dictated by that, use of sick leave or COVID time off or whatever these things are. These are real rudimentary, I consider. And so I'm just really baffled by that. But especially for you, Mr. Kirchner, how do you even have, usually with data, you have a foundation say, okay, we had 10 and now we have 8. So we've made an improvement of violent events. But if you have inconsistent, incomplete, underreported data, how would you as an auditor say, coming back in 3 years or so, how would you measure that?
Mr. Kirshner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator Kiffmeyer. I agree with the concern 100%, Senator Kiffmeyer, that in order to be able to understand clearly whether or not the department is making progress, it needs to be collecting certain types of data that it's not collecting. I will note, in reference to one of the things that you referred to in terms of HR information, one of the tricky challenges is that we know, for example, that someone is working during a pay period, but we don't know. We know the number of hours they worked that pay period, but we don't know on a day-to-day basis. We can't get down to that kind of granular level in the data of, were they working at this particular time? And then the other question is, even if we could get down to that granular level, we would not be able to figure out whether or not they were actually in the prison during that time, or perhaps they were taking a prisoner to a medical facility and were, accompanying a prisoner on a medical appointment or for an emergency medical procedure, and so they weren't in the prison, or they were away for training. They would still be paid during that time, but they would not be in the prison and providing security within the prison. And so it gets very, very difficult once you get down to a very granular level to figure out from human resources information whether or not staff were working at any given particular point in time. So that was the challenge that we faced. But we certainly do think that the department needs, we agree, I agree with you that I think it would be relatively straightforward for the department to just be keeping account of how many heads, are in the facility per shift. And, maybe that is something that they've already addressed. I mean, our report came out a year ago, but there are certain things that would be relatively easy to do, but there are other pieces that would be a little bit harder. And as I said, it's not just a matter of like, assigning somebody to collect the information. It would probably involve a real transformation away from the way that certain things are being done. Some of the ways that prisoners are tracked through the prison in terms of whether or not they are in in their living unit or away at a behavioral health session or away at recreation, some of those things are either not tracked or they're tracked on paper in ways that are, harder to look at more broadly. So that is a significant concern of ours, that the department get to the point that its progress or lack of progress can be effectively measured.
Mr.
Thank
Chair,
you,
if I
Mr.
could follow up. Yeah, thank you.
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So then I have a question for you. So counties are then licensed, and so this brings up, as it was brought up in your report as well. So when you have county licensing, what are some of these issues addressed through county licensing, such that if we applied some of that to the DOC, would that be helpful?
Mr. Kirschner.
Senator Kiffmeyer, I'm going to say I don't feel comfortable answering that question, partly because it's been a year since I worked on this report and looked at the county licensing things, and I didn't prep that for today's conversation. But also partly because we did focus primarily on the state's facilities, and we did not look a whole lot at the ways in which the department oversees county jails. That may be something the commissioner can answer, but I don't, at my fingertips, have a good sense of exactly what is required in the licensing process with regard to things like officer counts and whether or not it's by shift. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, I just have
Senator
one
Kiffmeyer.
follow-up here. So Mr. Kirschner, you said it's been about a year. Is this something that with a little review of your notes or some of those things, you could follow up with more information?
I'd be happy to work to. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I thank you, Senator Kiffmeyer. I'd be happy to look into that a little bit for you, Senator Kiffmeyer, and perhaps work together with the department to try and provide you with a little bit more information along those lines.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Kirschner.
Thank you. Next is Senator Bigham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think Senator Ingebrigtsen and I, with our county background, are thinking on the same track. And there's accreditations, and then there's licensing and inspection, and I think it all should come together and probably take a look at what level is best. I'm pleased to hear that the commissioner has said that he is bringing this information together. I also will say that whether it's the type of data collected and how we do it, in the report, it also talks about the investment in the infrastructure. It's going to cost money. And dedication of staff. And so I think we want to keep that in mind. I also know that there's a difference in the inspection in the counties versus kind of to Senator Kiffmeyer's point, and by no way, shape, or form am I saying that this answer is 100% right, or that I know this issue as an expert like the auditor, but I would also say there's different expectations due to the time that somebody stays in county versus stays in a state facility. And so I think there's different requirements for licensing and for outcomes. And so I guess both Senator Ingebrigtsen and Senator Kiffmeyer kind of hit on some of the issues I would like to focus that I had, so I'm not going to repeat those. But I think focusing on how we can collect the data to then make the best decisions with the department would be the first step in doing this. And so I think if we can drill down on what the department needs so that we can accurately collect the data so that we can make these decisions going forward, to me seems like a logical first step. And happy to work on that and have conversations with that, whether it's with Senator Matthews or somebody in the civil committee too, with data practices and different things like that. But I think it's important to have that conversation. But I'll end there because both Senator Ingebrigtsen and Senator Kiffmeyer kind of hit on what caught my attention in the report as well, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And thank you to the auditor and commissioner for being here today.
Next is Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is for Mr. Kirschner. In your slide presentation, I should say your PowerPoint presentation, you mentioned bullying and harassment among the staff. And I'm just wondering if you had any type of conversations with the law enforcement unions, or if there were any mention of possible staff, a whistleblower of type bringing these allegations or these things that happen. It seems like it sounded like from within, the supervisors and other people above them were not investigating or not paying attention to what happened. I'm just trying to find out what took place, if there was anything else that was investigated outside of what took place inside.
Mr. Kirschner.
Mr. Chair and Senator Anderson, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a very, well, to answer your first question, we did have in-depth visits at the 4 most secure facilities at St. Cloud, at Oak Park Heights, at Rush City, and at Stillwater. And we spent several days each facility. We met with union representatives. We met with several different groups of line staff. We met with folks that were not corrections officers, but rather were support staff, in food service or behavioral health or whatever, and with administrators. And we toured the facilities, during all 3 shifts, including the overnight shift. So we had a lot of different conversations with staff during that period of time. And as I also noted, there were some staff that reached out to us independently. So we heard a lot of different stories. With regard to the union's concerns about harassment and bullying, I think generally speaking, it's hard to characterize because we heard a lot of different stories from a lot of different people. But I would say, generally speaking, the concerns that we heard when we spoke with the union representatives often had to do with concerns about supervisors or people in more senior positions who were not necessarily treating people in more junior positions as well. When we talked to line staff, we heard some of that, but we also heard about bullying among people of the same level, which was not something that I think that generally speaking, that union representatives raised to us. Or across job categories. For example, you may have somebody who works in, and I don't want to try and tell a story here that might give something away, but let's say you have somebody who works in a maintenance role who might say, well, I was harassed by somebody who works as a behavioral health staff or as a corrections officer. So things that went, across job categories and across union representation even, because some of these staff are represented by different unions than one another. So I think it's a more complex story, and broadly speaking, 40% is a very large number for any workplace. And what we felt is that there was a ongoing culture at some of these institutions where this kind of harassment was not being dealt with essentially effectively. If the number was that large, it was not being dealt with as effectively as it needed to be dealt with by any employer if you have this level of harassment being reported. So that's something that we really felt the department needed to take some strong action about. And the commissioners already talked about some of the ways in which they have tried to address that. But I'm not sure if I got quite at the question you were asking, but it sounded like you were trying to get a little bit more information about what sorts of things we were talking about. Certainly, one of the stories I will tell, that because it appears in the report in an anonymized fashion, is of a corrections officer who had spoken out about something. And then that corrections officer at one point was in a situation where they called for backup. And the emergency response team said, we're not coming. And that to us was an extremely disturbing story. And the person who told us the story said, I didn't actually report it because I was afraid that there would be further retaliation. And these are people that are working in dangerous situations. And so to put oneself at risk is very difficult.
Senator Anderson, did you have a follow-up?
I did.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Oh, and by the way, Commissioner Schnell, if you feel as though you would want to engage in any of this, just put your hand up. Otherwise, if you don't put your hand up, I won't call on you. But I want to make sure you have the opportunity to respond if you choose. Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Kirshner, I'm just wondering, in your interview with the employees, staff, and online staff supervisor, whatever, did you sense that maybe because of the bullying that was going on, some of the things that were happening that didn't get reported, or that got reported and didn't get reacted to? Because I know of an individual myself who works at the Shakopee prison, and who, because of the circumstances there, have said that when retirement was coming up, they were getting out. They weren't going to extend. They were done. They were basically fed up with the way they were being treated. And so that's an example of, and I'm not saying names or anything, but I'm just wondering if, when you interviewed people, if that was the same kind of a scenario, or things that were being said to you as you interviewed.
Mr. Kirshner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Senator Anderson. I think what would be most accurate to say is that we heard a lot of different stories from a lot of different people, and a lot of different reactions to those stories. So there's not, did we talk to some people who said, I'm getting out just as soon as I can? Yes. Did we talk to other people who didn't say that? Yes. So, I mean, I think that that the extent to which people find a situation intolerable is going to vary from person to person. And so I think it's hard to categorize everybody we talk to and say they all said X, because they didn't. But it is certainly the case that we did hear some of these stories when we went and did our interviews. And it was one of the things that led to us putting questions about this into our survey of corrections officers and other staff, because actually we surveyed all staff that work in state facilities. You know, having heard some of those initial stories, we went ahead and asked about it, and we were, as I said, very disturbed to see the number of staff saying that they felt that bullying and harassment was a problem in their prison as high as 33%, and it was higher in some facilities. I believe in Oak Park Heights it was close to 50%. The numbers were very high for any workplace under any set of circumstances. But yes, I think that I think working in those, we viewed it as a function of safety, that you're not going to feel safe at your job if you're being harassed. And certainly the more safe, the more supported people feel at their jobs, the more likely they are to stay in their jobs. I think that's common sense. And I think that is certainly the way that the department views it as well, in terms of the comments that Commissioner Schnell has already made.
Commissioner Schnell.
Mr. Chair, senators and committee members on the whole, look, when I got here, one of the things that was really concerning is what we heard from people. We have to remember that these are among the most toxic environments that you can work in, most challenging places, the places where we put people and oftentimes warehouse them. And then have people having to go in every day and try to make a difference. And there are many people who do. But ultimately, the culture and the dynamics that we're aware of that have been highlighted here, we're not terribly surprised based on the information I had heard in that first year from talking to staff across the system. And to Senator Anderson, I've certainly heard many people talk about the fact that the minute I hit that magic mark, I'm gonna leave. And we need it, and we want this to be different. It has to be different for the good of the people we serve, And I have to say it, and for the good of the people who work there. The Department of Corrections has the highest rate of sick leave in the state enterprise. The Department of Corrections has the highest number of sexual harassment complaints anywhere in the state enterprise. These cultural dynamics are things that we have to address, and that I'm committed to addressing, that we're at. And we have a lot of work to do. And I think there are many people that work here that want it to be different. And we're committed to getting there, as challenging as that is. We're investing in an additional investigator because the numbers of investigations is as high as it is. And it's a troubling reality. But if we're going to take it seriously, we have to put our money where our mouth is.
Thank you, Commissioner. Senator Anderson, did you have a follow-up question?
I did not, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to get the answers.
We'll move to Senator Latz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I commend the OLA for the work that they've done. This is just one more illustration of the value of that office toward improving state enterprises and the work that we all as a state try to do to improve the lives of the people in Minnesota. I also want to applaud Commissioner Schnell for his proactive response to the OLA report that came out a year ago, taking the recommendations seriously, taking concrete steps to address and start to address those issues that were raised. I know that Commissioner Schnell is the kind of organizational leader that is capable of and does think conceptually about how an organization is set up and what the best things are to try to get results out of an organization. And not every person is the kind of person who's capable of doing that, let alone takes it seriously enough and is willing to engage in the tough issues and the tough decisions. Obviously, changing behavior is going to involve some cultural change, but also it's probably going to involve some serious discipline, up and down the chain, because people don't only change behavior because you tell them to, or because they think it's the right thing to do, or they don't agree with you when you say it's the right thing to do. Sometimes you just need to bring the hammer down on occasion, and we're going to have to recognize that that's going to happen. That there's going to be disciplinary actions taken in response to these things. And we're going to have to be in a position to be supportive of the administration when they are taking those disciplinary actions, to get everyone in the organization to realize there are real consequences to behaving outside what society is establishing as a norm of good behavior, and not necessarily what they in their own workplace may think is the norm for good behavior, or get it from their own little circles of where they socialize and family and so on. But we're here to set societal standards, and that applies inside the prisons just like it does anywhere else. I want to highlight what Senator Bigham said, which is that some of this is going to come down to a matter of resources. Whether it's a matter of having sufficient staffing, not just filling the number of correctional officer spots that are necessary, but having the other resources to be able to look internally and to take steps internally to make these changes. And we as a legislature cannot expect the department to make all of the positive changes unless we are willing to put our money where our mouths are and put the resources into the agency. Commissioners said they're $20 million behind in terms of information technology upgrading. And we've been hearing this for a long time. And it's easy to put that off as we're focusing on other things, but it has real consequences. So one of the questions I have for Mr. Kirchner is, in his observation, was this a matter of what role did the current status of technology have in the absence of the data that you were looking for? And whether it's a matter of not having systems that have the capabilities, that don't have the memory, the power, aren't properly programmed, the software is old, several different systems can't talk across systems to the others to share information? What role would you say technology plays in this, and what role would you say has to do with simply not consciously itemizing and entering data, which of course takes personnel time to do as well?
Mr. Kirshner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Senator Latz. I think both are issues, actually. Certainly, there were some things that we encountered where we kind of felt like a technological solution could provide more and better information to the department than it currently has, or to I should say sometimes to wardens and to prison administrators than they currently have. For example, when we were in a prison and watching people getting kind of clocked in and out by taking note cards and putting them up into a little kind of grid of cards to indicate where people went. That's the kind of thing where that's the one would think that if that were done using some sort of computerized system, a record could automatically be generated that would then we would then be able to know how often did each particular prisoner go to their particular behavioral health session or their chemical dependency session, or even just to recreate in the gym, and we would have some of that information. But if you're just moving cards around in a grid, then you're not gonna be able to end up with anything that provides you that information. But at the same time, certainly we saw an emphasis on, as I said before, an emphasis on decision-making by story, almost, that there would be particular high-profile incidents that people would remember, and they would be remembered for years and years, and sometimes decades. When we were at St. Cloud, we went and visited a basketball court that is all overgrown. There's grass growing up through the cracks and everywhere. It hasn't been used in many, many years. Well, why hasn't it been used in many, many years? Because there was an officer who was violently assaulted and beaten there some 25 years ago. And at that point, that basketball court was closed down and has not been used since. And that may have been the right choice, but it's not. That's a single event. And perhaps the answer might not have been to say only to close down the basketball court, but to make different types of choices about the ways in which that court was monitored and the way in which officers were stationed there, or any one of a number of other things. But it was kind of held up as well, this was the event. And then here is the response we made. As a policy choice in response to this event, we reduced the number of basketball, and I don't know if it was actually from 2 to 1, but I'll say this. We reduced the number of total basketball courts available in the facility from 2 to 1 because of this singular event. And that's one example, but there were other things where which we came across. And another example that I can think of from another facility was the fact that the prisoners played baseball. And so they had access to baseball bats. And we asked a guard, well, that's an interesting thing. They have access to baseball bats. And the guard said, well, no one's hit anybody with a baseball bat yet. But as soon as that happens, we probably won't let them play baseball anymore. But it hasn't happened yet, and so it's not yet become an issue. As I said, that is something that we kind of observed overall about the way in which decisions were made, is that decisions were made based often upon specific events and specific stories that then led to, oh, that's a big risk, we have to do something about it, as opposed to a more general, broad, kind of data-driven approach. Okay, over X number of years, how many assaults have occurred in this basketball court, and is that safer or less safe than this other location, the yard or wherever else, and then what can we do about that? So it's a combination, I think, of both lack of the data availability, but also we did encounter what we thought were kind of cultural approaches to how information is learned about what promotes safety, that we thought were worth taking, the department worth taking another look at and thinking differently about how they made decisions.
Thank you. We're getting down to 10 minutes left of our committee time. So Just wanted to give everyone a quick notice. Senator Latz, you had a follow-up.
Yeah, just a final comment, if I may. We now have a better idea of what kind of data the OLA thinks would be useful to gather to help in that decision making. So that itself is very beneficial for future decision making. We now have to enable the DOC to have the resources to collect that data. So I hope that as we're moving forward and we're looking at ways to do that, that we can remember today's hearing and respond appropriately. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had this question in mind before Senator Anderson asked, and it's a similar question. So I'll give opportunities if the commissioner or Mr. Kirschner have already covered these topics. But on the issues that were discussed on the harassment of staff and the sexual assaults against staff, I'd like a clarifying question, Mr. Kirschner, in your comments on on staff not feeling supported. Is that there's no change of status, no repercussion against the offender that did that to them? If it's like a person of the prison population, what does no support mean? And Commissioner Schnell, I know you spoke to this issue a little bit, but I did want my general question before Senator Anderson's was to give you a chance to further expound on what your plans would be to rectify these two issues that were identified. And perhaps you've already covered everything you want to say on that. If there's any more, I'd give that opportunity. But those are the 2 points I'd like addressed, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Schnell, do you want to go first, or Mr. Kirschner? Who did you direct the question to, Senator?
If Mr. Kirschner maybe could address the staff support and if there are issues to the prisoner or whoever committed the act first and what he means by that.
Mr. Kirschner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Senator Matthews. Generally speaking, I think the lack of support would kind of fall into two approaches. One would be there sometimes simply things were not seen as important enough to report by male colleagues, whereas the female staff subjected to these behaviors often were very unhappy about them, obviously. And prisoners, and I do want to make absolutely clear that it's not the case that every single prisoner engages in these types of activities. It is only a minority, but that still is very unpleasant for the staff that have to put up with it because, of course, they have to check all the cells, once a day, and so they're going to see those same people again and again. And the other thing to note is that sometimes, staff were told, this is just kind of part of the job and you have to put up with it. Or they were doubted. One staff person told us of being asked to verify, if you like, that this had occurred, that a prisoner had exposed themselves to them by describing part of his anatomy, so they would know whether or not that had occurred, which we found to be completely inappropriate. So that's so the combination of either it's not important enough to report, or if they do report it, being told that this is just something you kind of have to deal with. And we don't believe that having to interact with people that are masturbating in front of you is something that anybody in any workplace should just have to deal with. Now, that being said, it is important to note that the appropriate action to take against prisoners may or may not be disciplinary punishment. There are a lot of prisoners in our facilities that are dealing with various types of mental illnesses, and it may be a therapeutic response is appropriate as opposed to a disciplinary response, but there should be a response. And we did feel that we were hearing too often that there was no response at all, or the response that was there was not sufficient.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So maybe if Commissioner Schnell could expound on if there's a plan in place to address that.
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Senator Matthews, the answer is yes. I think, first of all, we want every one of these incidents taken seriously and reported. There's no doubt that these things have profound impact, and they cannot be minimized by our staff. We have to make sure that we're responding and that we are taking the steps, as Mr. Kirshner said, in our disciplinary actions, which I can assure you has been happening. Remember, we've had conversations about the use of disciplinary segregation, and so how we manage these types of incidents have been something that our staff have been working on, and we have developed a metric for response to these kinds of situations. And I think really importantly is the fact that we created this new employee support, peer support response network that ultimately right now is staffed by a couple of full-time DOC staff, longtime staff, who when these types of incidents occur, are advised and reach out to the staff who are impacted in this way, because I think it's really important that we send a message that what they experienced was not okay and should not have occurred, and we cannot minimize them. So ultimately, we want to make sure that there are actions from an internal disciplinary standpoint. If the conduct rises to the level of criminal conduct, and we've had this for somebody who has been grabbed or touched or whatever it may have been, we want to make sure that those cases are thoroughly investigated and referred for additional prosecution, and we have been doing that. These are things that become part of the dynamic, the culture, and as somebody who has in the past, worked with social workers working in even in nursing home settings, there were times when staff in nursing home settings would be assaulted, seriously assaulted, and nothing would happen. And again, it was really they didn't in some cases report. In some cases, it was seen as a reflection on them as a person who worked in that facility. And ultimately, I think as Mr. Kirshner points out, we know that some of these activities are driven strictly and solely by kind of criminal intent. And sometimes it can be because of a range of issues. In either case, we have to do a better job of supporting our staff who experience them and addressing and taking steps to minimize the impact of someone else and intervening in the most appropriate way possible with the person who engaged in the conduct.
Senator Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner Schnell, I appreciate your comments just now, because one of the things I found is that money won't fix culture. You can have a new building. If the culture is not good, it doesn't really matter. And so I see in some of these things or proposals that you have, but really, Commissioner Schnell, it is you yourself as the commissioner and the governor that establish a culture that protects prisoners, that protects staff, but that cultural mindset is really beyond money. And I really hope, Commissioner, because this report is a year old, I thought that I might have heard a few things a little more specific after this, but I also know we've had a unique time in the last little while. And so I'm understanding of that. However, in the meantime, people who are being wounded or hurt, bullied, harassed, some of them not even accounted for. And I think sometimes underreporting usually happens because they figure nothing will happen. And then they just expose themselves by saying something. And so that's usually the cause of underreporting. Why bother? Nothing's happening. But Commissioner Schnell, I believe you're a gentleman, and I believe you're taking on this job to do some of these things. And I really hope, though, that through you and your managers, assistant commissioners, deputy commissioners, there's a lot of folks there that really on the top level, that the culture is addressed in that perspective. And I look forward to hearing maybe some specifics in the future about some of those changes being made that are beyond the finance. So thank you, Commissioner Schnell, for being here today.
Thank you.
Senator Bingham, if you could make your question
Yep.
quick,
Yep.
we're at our deadline.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I still need to say something.
Okay, Commissioner, it mentions the plan for facility renewal, and it specifically talks about St. Cloud and Stillwater. Would you, I'm new to the committee, it might be helpful if you could provide, at least me, I don't know if others on the committee would be helpful, you know, some of your facility bonding requests that you've had. If you in fact do have any sort of, I don't know, thoughts of your own on what a facility plan would look like, or if you are currently putting together, you know, an internal team that is going to look at the facility plan. So just any of that information would be helpful. I know that this fall or late, fall, during the bonding bill, there was an appropriation, but I know that that was more specific to Willow Creek in Togo. And so anyway, it just would be helpful as a new member. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Kirschner, we're over our time limit. If you have a comment, please, if you could make it brief, that would be helpful.
I just wanted to note, I forgot to say this to Senator Bingham and to any other newer members of the committee. If you did not receive a written copy of the report and you would like to receive one, please let me know. We'd be happy to get that to you in whatever way you'd like to get that, in addition to the, the one that's online. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Kirchner. Just a few ending comments. I really appreciated the discussion. We covered a lot of ground today, and I'm glad we had the commissioner as well as Mr. Kirchner here from the OLA. Having worked in a correction facility, this is, I think most people need to know, this is an extremely difficult environment to work in. It is not the standard bureaucracy that we see anywhere else in the state. It's very, very difficult, even on good days, at least in a male felon facility. I would say it's like a locker room environment, but on steroids, and the consequences can get severe. The thing that bothered me the most in the report was this growing trend of bullying, and it may involve staff, as well as the accusations of sexual harassment that went left unheeded by superiors. That tells me that there is a much more cultural environment that needs to be rooted up. And also the assault on officers. Assault on officers, at least the experiences I've seen, inmates just don't go and beat up an officer without some reason. And I would say there's a reason coming from an individual or a few officers. And when you start seeing the pattern of superior officers not responding to sexual harassment or bullying, and if that's ever transposed to an inmate population, there will be reaction. And inmates don't usually do that because the consequences are so severe. Sitting in a segregation cell for over a year is pretty severe for doing that. Oftentimes it's even more than that. So I think there's one of the major areas is a cultural one. And like I say, it's a very extreme environment to work in. I said it was a locker room on steroids, but that's shared. That's a shared locker room by both inmates and officers that are participating in that attitude. So that's why I got out of it. I got out of the corrections field because that was beginning to change my sense of humor. It was beginning to change my reaction to other things outside of the walls of a correction facility, and I didn't want that. Very, very important to watch how it affects officers. Having said that, I'm grateful for the report that we had, and it'll give us some direction later this year. We have no further business before this committee, and we stand adjourned. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.